Hello and welcome to episode 17 of Unpacking Articles. The article we're going to unpack today is about a topic that generates a lot of discussion among language educators, and that is the topic of textbooks. The article is called Grammar in Disguise: The Hidden Agenda of Communicative Language Teaching Textbooks. And the article is challenging the label communicative being used in materials and whether that is truly the case or whether it's just a buzzword. The article starts off with a discussion of the role of grammar instruction within communicative language teaching. And one thing we need to review to understand this part is the contrast between focus on forms, focus on form, and focus on meaning. And the simplest way that I can put it is, in focus on forms plural, you learn about the language and then you practice. In focus on form singular, on the other hand, form-focused instruction is seen as being supportive of communication. So you lead with a communicative goal, and then you address form as needed to achieve that communicative goal. And finally, focus on meaning, as you can probably tell, is about focusing entirely on meaning, and any type of explicit grammar instruction is viewed as unnecessary for acquisition. In textbooks, the main issue is that they tend to approach grammar instruction in a very traditional way, with presentation, practice, production, PPP. And you could say this is very much aligned with focus on forms, plural. I'll teach you a rule, you practice it, and then you use it for something. And research has also shown that textbooks do not provide enough input. They move to output too quickly. Of course, what is enough input, right? You could never have enough input, fair point. But in the case of textbooks, it seems that this issue is exacerbated. And based on what we know about language acquisition, we cannot move so quickly from input to output. Another distinction that is relevant for this article and that we saw in a previous episode is the different types of drills. So let's review very quickly here. Mechanical drills are all about form. Students don't have to pay any attention to meaning. In a meaningful drill, the students have to pay attention to meaning, but there is a correct answer expected. And finally, communicative drills are things like take turns asking each other these questions. And they're provided with a list of questions, usually targeting a particular structure. And even though communicative drills have that little word communicative in their name, there is a drawback with communicative drills. And this quote summarizes it best. It says, communicative drills come the closest to replicating real-world tasks. But since students are not accountable for the information they exchange, there is no motivation to ensure comprehension through the negotiation of meaning. In other words, there's no purpose to them. The purpose is to practice a particular grammar point. And so in this study, the authors are trying to determine whether textbooks that claim to be communicative are truly communicative or not. And the way they operationalize communicative is by looking at how much input students are getting and whether the activities are drills or not. And they looked at 4 Spanish textbooks and 4 German textbooks. They were all college-level textbooks that have been recently published, and they all claimed to be communicative. Within each book, they only looked at 2 chapters that were about the same grammar structure. And they coded each activity as follows. First, whether the activity was an input or an output activity, based on whether or not students were required to produce the target form. And then output activities were sub-classified as drills or non-drills. Non-drill activities were those where the students were exchanging information for a purpose, and the authors call it communicative practice. Among the drills, they classify them according to the 3 types that we saw before: mechanical, meaningful, and communicative. What did they find? When it comes to input versus output, most of the activities were output activities where the students were required to produce the form soon after having been explained what that form was. So about 70% of the activities were output and 30% were input. Now, when it comes to drills versus non-drills, about 50-50 in the German textbooks. So half of them were drills and half of them were non-drills. And the total for the Spanish textbooks was about 60% non-drills, 40% drills. With respect to the different types of drills, the result that caught my eye was that about 36% of the drills in the Spanish textbooks were mechanical drills. Mechanical drills do not require any attention to meaning. In other words, they do not contribute anything to language acquisition. All in all, this quote from the conclusion captures my thoughts exactly. It says, "It is quite obvious that the way most textbooks are designed today, with much of the emphasis on output at the expense of input, does not actually contribute to language acquisition." The bottom line for me is that the focus on forms mold seems very hard to break. We have come to expect textbooks to explain structures one at a time, followed by practice. Based on these results, as well as based on my own experiences looking at textbooks, not much has changed except for labels. It's not uncommon to see activities in textbooks being labeled as communicative or interactive, and yet when you look at them, it is really just about practicing a grammar point. So let's talk about some of the limitations of the study. The first issue that I see is with the classification. To say that an input activity is an activity that doesn't require the production of a form is a limited view on what input is. I would have preferred a more fine-grained look at the input activities as well as the non-drill activities. And the biggest limitation for me is how they operationalized communicative. To me, teaching grammar points one at a time followed by any type of practice is not communicative. So going back to the beginning, I don't think this article set out to find out if the books were indeed communicative. Instead, this seemed to be much more about whether books were including communicative practice within grammar sections. And that begs the question, is that really communicative? To me, that's not enough to determine whether materials are communicative. We first need to answer the question of what proficiency-based communicative goals are driving the content, and then we can look at the activities that are included. And that goes for all instructional materials or even the curriculum. It's not just about textbooks. The takeaway is look past the labels and the buzzwords. And this is why I think it's so important to be informed. If you have a good grasp on the fundamentals of language development, then you'll be empowered to make decisions based on what you know and not just labels or marketing strategies. That's just my take on it. As usual, I encourage you to read the original and draw your own conclusions. Thank you for tuning in, and until next time.